Thanks to Miss Spudnut and Caveland the Plan for helping with the funding for this video. If you'd like to get your own special shoutout or get some special perks on the side, consider joining the Patreon today. These perks are also available through coffee and channel memberships. The links are in the description. Well, looks like we're about to have another video tradition upon us. At this rate, we're bound to have at least one SpongeBob-esque video every year. Some of you may remember we had that video last year to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the show, and the year before that, we covered the movie trilogy. Or trilogy back then. So naturally, if we're to keep this party rolling, we'll need a different approach for the franchise to keep things fresh. First I was thinking of covering the new trilogy of modern SpongeBob movies, but that's clearly gonna take longer than I expected. At the time I'm recording this, the Plankton movie won't be out for about a month, and yes, I chose to avoid the leaks, and I would prefer keeping it that way, thank you. And there's also the Search for SquarePants, but that won't be out until much later in the year. So currently, that just leaves us with... yeah, not a whole lot for promising substance in that field. So seeing how that plan's gonna be on hold for months, why don't we fill the gap by exploring something that's more direct to the show itself? Something shorter, and yet perhaps way more exhausting and obnoxious and painful on different levels. Oh yeah, we're going through a handful of what's been deemed the worst of SpongeBob episodes. Oh, the damage they've caused to so many of these beloved characters and the stories they were put through. Dear Neptune, have mercy on us all. Will we ever survive? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Honestly, I can't really say I've had that much experience with some of these episodes. As some of you may remember me saying, I stopped watching the show regularly after season 6. Which in hindsight really helped me dodge a bullet, as I heard that's when the show really took a dive for a while. Guess I jumped ship at the right time, huh? Well, okay, not completely. There were still other painful episodes around that era. But on the bright side, there were also some pretty enjoyable episodes in the later seasons too. But I'm starting to get sidetracked. We'll have to dig through some of the bad to find some of the good in some cases, and I feel this might be no exception. But that's gonna be for a later video. So how will I end up finding these episodes? Could they be as bad as everyone else says? Could they be worse? Or better? Well, that's what I'm here to find out. And oh boy, I have a feeling we've got quite a feat of strength ahead of us. Oh, barnacles. So my findings for what's been deemed the worst episodes have been determined on what's been scored through IMDb. Yeah, that's right. We're going for the old I hate everything search for the worst route. But then again, I thought it could also help make this video feel a bit more community-based. So we'll see how it goes as this goes on. With that said, our journey starts with the lowest in the whole series, Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful, and a Pal for Gary. But nowadays, I'm pretty sure we all know which is really the worst of the pair here.
Oh no!
Keep Bikini Bottom Beautiful may have been mediocre and overly played out with repetitive jokes at worst, but at best it could still be fairly watchable. I can't guarantee that, but hey, maybe you'll find something amusing in that episode. But this episode, oh my god. Look fellas, I'm gonna try not turning this whole video into a hate fest if I can help it, but this one was quite a painful start. As much as I tried, I have no idea how to properly justify the outcome or even understand the whole thought process here.
Obviously there wasn't one.
I mean, yeah, the very start of the setup can be relatable to some people, as I'm sure a lot of us who've had pets would feel very bad every now and then to remember they may have to be left alone at home. And maybe they wanted to make an over-the-top story with that kind of scenario, which, hey, that's perfectly fine at its core. That is, until we get to Puffy Fluffy. Yeah, from here it starts feeling a bit more like Gremlins, but minus the charm and planning. Now, Beast Fluffy may look kinda neat in its own way, and it puts up a decent threat and a fight, but most of that in-string atmosphere is replaced with frustration when you see Gary's the only one seeing this as a threat and getting most of the torment for whatever reason. It just takes away a lot of the potential that could have made this appealing, don't you think? And it really doesn't help that SpongeBob just adds on to the pain, even when the threat's right in front of him. Honestly, they could have probably just told us SpongeBob was getting high on some fumes coming from Puffy Fluffy or something, and that could have probably been a fair explanation to a surprisingly bigger lack of brain here. Or we could keep putting the blame on SpongeBob's assumption toward Gary being jealous, but as painfully shown throughout this episode, that excuse can only go so far. But the worst element that comes from this episode is when you think back and realize, what did Gary do to deserve all this? I mean, they could have easily added a few seconds of Gary misbehaving in the story, you know, like wrecking the house and stuff. It wouldn't even need that much planning or sturdily thought out reason. Simple frustrations would be enough to justify his tempered behavior, and thus springboarding the entire rest of the episode. And even with that addition, very little thought would have been required, if any really. And given a lot of the other season 7 episodes, it looks like that was how the writers liked it back then, with little to no planning. I mean, you look through a lot of these season 7 episodes and you can already tell they had little to no planning just with how painful they were. And again, I'm trying to keep a level head here, but dang, this was a really tough start. I mean, like a nasty trip at the starting line. But thankfully, we're done with what's said to be the worst episode by far. But I can already tell all these others coming up will find ways to be comparably bad. Maybe slightly more tolerable, but still, I sense a great disturbance in the force. Yepers, another season 7 episode already. 2 in a row. Give a big hand to our competitors, everyone. They deserved it. Now, I'll admit, One Course Meal was one of the very few season 7 episodes I saw when it was still new, and yeah, not much has changed on the outlook. But still, this one was surprisingly a bit more of a hard case. Hard to determine, and equally hard to watch. Though I have to say, when compared to A Pal for Gary, there were a few more moments that I feel were a bit more of attention grabbers. Plankton's attack had some amusing moments, and Mr. Krabs' fear of mines, while coming from out of nowhere, was slightly funny too. The problem though is that these were only at the very beginning and the very end of the episode, and the negative side jam-packs the whole remainder of the episode in between. So in this episode, it turns out that Plankton has a fear of whales. Which, yeah, okay, this works on a biological level, but in this case, Plankton never really seemed bothered by this before, especially as he and Pearl were seen in the same room a few different times. So we can cut one of them out if we don't include the algae's always greener, since it's mostly debatable. But regardless, I found this side of Plankton to be kind of abrupt. But maybe they're trying to tell us his family got eaten sometime after all that?
That's the bite of 80s!
I don't know, that's the best connection I can see here. However, Mr. Krabs decides to use this newfound knowledge to torment Plankton to some rather concerning lengths, going as far as to dress up as his own daughter Pearl and stalking Plankton. Yeah, it certainly sounds weird from a distance, and yet it feels way more unpleasant as we see how this affects him over time. And maybe it's just me, but I don't think it's fair to say Plankton's really done enough for this treatment to be justified, especially if we're going off of this episode alone. And it certainly doesn't help that this goes low enough for Plankton where he has thoughts of having himself done in and showing his whole suffering? Yeah, okay, if the earlier torment wasn't enough, I think we can all agree this was starting to go too far. And it really doesn't help that Krabs had one of the worst reactions to all of this. And despite everything, it ends up with no one being on Plankton's side through all of this. Well, except for SpongeBob. Eventually. You might think I'm looking too deeply into this, but a lot of what we can see Plankton going through during all this can be connected to a lot of serious real-life problems anyone can go through, let alone the little kids who were watching this at the time, and there's a chance some of them might have developed some kind of toxic thought process as they were watching through this, and oh my god, that's just disturbing to imagine. So anyway, how can we fix this problem? Oh, here's an easy way to start off. Don't do it. This whole plot just comes off harsh and unnecessary overall. If they really wanted to make this work, they could have, I don't know, given Mr. Krabs a reason for not being there and then have trust in Pearl to run the place again? And maybe that way, Plankton's fear could still be present without any or as much forced cruelty. And hey, if they played their cards right, they could use a few minutes to allow Plankton to overcome this fear, only to then find out there was never anything to worry about. Or at least around Pearl. I just feel the scares we see Plankton go through here would have required a lot of awful behavior in this episode alone to justify it. But given the time frame they were given and the executive standards, I highly doubt they would have been able to successfully pull it off that way. And, well, needless to say, the show just doesn't really have the tact to handle the situations they provided here in a way that won't come off tasteless. It's a shame too, because like I was saying, I feel this idea probably wouldn't have been so frowned upon had the writers not been so extreme with it to the point of going where they did. Maybe if someday they ever end up making an episode similar to this, I'm not saying they should, but if they do, maybe they'll learn from their mistakes and make something a bit more decent from it. We can only hope, at least, because regardless, we've still got plenty of past mistakes to look back on and still a lot of pain to endure. Oh boy. Speaking of pain, the Splender was a pretty big exhibit for that on different levels. I'll give them this though. They knew this would be a small but painful mishap that just about all of us can relate to. Even if by chance you never had a splinter in your life, I think you can imagine how much it sucks getting a sharp wood chip stabbing into your skin. Yeah, it may be unpleasant on its own, but if the writers had a thorough enough plan on where to go with this, it might work and lead to something pretty enjoyable. The episode Once Bitten was a fairly good example of that. But instead, what we got here was a huge emphasis reminding us how much this would hurt, along with moments that come off overly disgusting and obnoxious, and they all play out on a scale till they get mostly unnecessary and flat out boring. Regardless of how you might have felt about it before, there's little chance this story can keep you interested enough to keep watching, and it's all because of that 11-minute time frame they have to keep going. You see why this would be a problem, right? If you don't like this kind of pain and gross out material, then you're really gonna have a bad time. And even if you do find amusement in that kind of stuff, you better hope you've got the patience for how much they shove it in your face the whole time. Because this takes up so much of the episode to the point where it's very likely to get dull before long. And honestly, I can't think of that many ways to make this easier to sit through without cutting the length of the episode itself. Let's say they were allowed to. This kind of layout would probably work as a standard short. In 5 minutes or so, they could use most of what they had without resorting to the dragging out to make the usual 11 minutes. Or if they really had to keep the usual time frame they had, maybe they could cut down on a few scenes like...
Interesting.
Oh! Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
that. And maybe they could put those extra minutes into SpongeBob sneaking out, and maybe leaving a decoy to trick Mr. Krabs into thinking he's still there for a moment. That would fit, given parts of the joke structure they had back then. And SpongeBob, meanwhile, could use that time to see the local doctor for help with a splinter. There's a better chance for some easier going and probably more amusing, clever jokes with him. But based on what we got in the end, I know the current crew behind the show isn't all that hardcore when it comes to continuity between certain episodes, but I have a feeling this is a specific lesson that's gonna stick with SpongeBob and maybe some writers for a long time. Well, hopefully. Oh yeah, Stuck in the Ringer was another of those Season 7 episodes I happened to catch when it was new. And it really bummed me out to see how miserable SpongeBob was getting because of Patrick and the town turning against him simply for getting mad at the circumstances he was thrown into. Yeah, this was quite a depressing, unpleasant episode in many different ways. But the good news is that the pieces of agony gave me a lot to think about and different ways to plan out how this can go. And I think I came up with something at least more tolerable to go with this premise. For starters, maybe the gluing incident can stay in. However, this would be a freak accident caused by SpongeBob where he spills some on the ringer somehow, and he doesn't realize there's super forever glue on it until it's too late. Yeah, it still may not be the smartest way to start it off, but really, anything like that could work as long as Patrick doesn't have to be the reason for him getting glued in.
There you go, buddy. Now you're stuck forever.
Gee, thanks, Patrick.
I'm ready for glue.
Because as we can tell here, by not making Patrick the cause of SpongeBob's situations constantly going downhill to crashing and burning, this could take a huge weight off his stupidity and make him a lot less of an unlikable obstacle. And some of that time could be used for creative jokes with him that won't make the viewers hate him the whole way through. This could also leave space for jokes that are lighter and not as harsh on SpongeBob, like maybe some creative and goofy bits to keep this conflict in a little higher spirits. And speaking of, the crowd can have a decent role here too. How about when they see how SpongeBob's turned out and how Patrick's affecting him during all this? This could lead to some arguments for everyone, steadily escalating to bigger, more comical fights over time based on who they think is more in the wrong. By this route, they could A, lead to some potential for more cartoony gags, and B, push everyone back so they're not all making this torment on SpongeBob completely one-sided. And on top of all that, this could give SpongeBob and Patrick the chance to see all the fighting going on and listen in on everyone's takes in the situation that came between them. And all this could lead up to the usual conclusion of them wrapping up this whole solution with their tears again, or maybe the sweat of the crowd fighting each other, or maybe something like that. I still wouldn't say this would be a great episode. I mean, again, this was Season 7. How much can ideally be salvaged here? Regardless, I feel this can take away a lot of the annoying portion. Though not all of them, that would take a far bigger challenge with risk. But I do see a bit less of a crushing headache to come from a layout like this. Don't you think? So, funny thing about this segment, the next episode was gonna be about the Ballad of Filthy Muck, or maybe the Nitwitting? Well, that's the thing, these two were paired up on their airing, and I honestly can't decide which one would be better fitting. So I figured I'll just save that for some kind of future episode, and for now we're gonna skip ahead to the first, special in the bunch.
SpongeBob, you're fired!
The outcome for this one was a pretty unique kind of bad. They had the chance and potential to take a simple concept that a lot of people can relate to and bring it to an enjoyable and fairly satisfying outcome. But instead, this ends up with what can basically be summed up as
nothing!
It's like they can't have 3 minutes go by without having a scene being stretched to insanity. Either by SpongeBob's depression, or concerning implications toward unemployment, or who knows what else. But while the use of the 20-minute length they were given was handled in one of the blandest ways possible, the fact they had a 20-minute frame at all helps raise possibilities on what can be changed to make this a more memorable and interesting journey. For starters, they could drastically cut down on the time used for SpongeBob's depressed state. And instead, they could use that time for, I don't know, presenting his other skills and experiences for a job search? We've seen a lot of what SpongeBob's been capable of in so many other episodes, and they could have used this to add a bigger, more colorful variety of substance for SpongeBob to think about during this whole episode. And this could also give more material for the writers to deliver. Think about it. We could have 5 minutes of stuff like this, or just keep the 5 minutes of this. I think the more interesting choice is pretty obvious here. Or at the very least, don't use so much time presenting him as a downer, because I'm pretty sure that's not what most of the viewers are here for. They could use a time skip to show when SpongeBob gets out of his slump and starts cheering up again. That's the SpongeBob everyone knows and loves, the guy who finds joy in his life, and not whatever this is. Or, if they wanted to keep the connections of SpongeBob's old job, they could make a story about how he has to travel to different places. Like for a random example, maybe he becomes a police assistant after getting fired, and he finds some of the crimes that he has to investigate that center around fast food, or maybe even plankton. And this keeps reminding him of the Krusty Krab and makes him consider trying to go back on his own. This feels like it could have a more satisfying outcome instead of, being tugged around at an insanely rushed closing with the time they had remaining at that point. Honestly, I really hope they get another chance like this in a few years. Maybe with a similar concept and time frame, and by then I hope the writers don't loaf around and jam-pack another load of nothing into this. Because the idea of this can go a lot of places if they really try. Next we have Demolition Doofus. Oh man, now this one was a nightmare, and I'm not putting that lightly. This was horrifying from multiple angles, whether it's from the story that was provided, or imagining what the kids were probably thinking when they first saw this. It all comes out feeling like details you might find in an actual bad dream. Now sure, we've seen that Mrs. Puff has negative thoughts for SpongeBob a number of times before, but what makes this time so different? Well, maybe it's her point of snapping, leading to a concerning fantasy of demise, and actively attempting to follow through with it? Yeah, in many scenarios, this would be enough for anyone to raise red flags and make a run for it. And the fact that most of this heavy conflict was coming from SpongeBob's own teacher when this never crossed her mind beforehand, for good reasons might I add, I can understand why everyone would be put off by this. But if they really wanted to play this off with less of the horrific implication that's being presented, well then that would be the first step. Like, to see Mrs. Puff going down this rabbit hole, maybe it could be not so much an implication, more so a blind instinct. Like, let's say her injury here led to some other side effects along with her lack of puff. Like, maybe it gives her a split personality, or makes her go loopy and hallucinates. Maybe the effects cause her to see SpongeBob as some kind of monster or whatever. Going this way, it could help give Mrs. Puff a slight bit of leeway on where she's coming from throughout this whole episode. Correct me if I'm missing something, but I think a lot of us can agree the fact that putting SpongeBob in the car show and trying to end him all coming solely from her volition is not really helping Mrs. Puff's character. Because think of it this way, what's stopping her from potentially doing something like this again at a later point? We see she's going this far now, so there's a chance she can always do it again. But let's say she was going through something that would end up putting a pause on this kind of behavior. A split personality could lead to a Jekyll and Hyde scenario. That way, her more malicious side would have more of a reason as to why she's doing all this in the first place. And not only that, it could add an ending to cure Mrs. Puff turning her back to normal, and in a way that allows Mrs. Puff and SpongeBob to make amends. Or what about the hallucination route? It's still possible for SpongeBob to cure her there too, and upon recovery, she could see SpongeBob's a lot less scary than how she saw him in the last couple minutes. Heck, going in those directions, her thoughts of killing SpongeBob or wanting to get rid of him could probably be a bit more justified this way. It could have helped explain and balance things out a little better by giving her an over-the-top symptom like this that goes out of her control. Sure, it might still lead to some scary incidents, but it could probably at least fit in with those kinds of directions they had her going. Or, you know, at least just throw her into slammer for attempted murder. That works too, I guess.
Stop! You violated the law.
But overall, the good news is that Mrs. Puff hasn't been as malicious after this episode, or at least to my knowledge. So maybe that's progress on her character and the writer's restraints. But even still, I wouldn't completely hold my breath, as we may never know what's gonna happen to her later on. Oh dear. Well, by the looks of it, Ink Lemonade's the most modern episode I was able to find on the list. And surprisingly, it's also the most complex episode we've gone through so far. Not because of how bad it is exactly, but more so by how to work around it. I'll give them this right out of the gate. It's kinda neat seeing them finally make an episode with the concept of Squidward and ink. That detail works, and, you know, he's a classified octopus. Or at least that's what I heard, but feel free to correct me on that if I missed something. Well, anyway, this element is certainly something new and makes sense given specific details. But seeing all the shoehorned gross-out material and undeserved torment that Squidward goes through, yeah, I can definitely see why a lot of people hate this one. So, I had to weave through a bit more ins and outs to find a new way to go into this and make it work. So how about this? Maybe they start off the same way, with Patrick trying to make a lemonade stand, and they learn that Squidward can squirt ink. But instead of having everyone drink it, SpongeBob and Patrick find out the ink can be used as a form of paint. They start off by using it to make signs to promote the lemonade stand, and that later inspires them to make different art with it that gets everyone's attention. Yeah, the idea of painting with someone else's fluids is still kinda messed up when you think about it. Or would you prefer to go back and see everyone drink the stuff?
Ah, sick!
Yeah, that's what I thought. Then Patrick eventually feels like getting more. But instead of constantly scaring Squidward, he could, perhaps find ways to make him sneeze, like pulling pranks or something. That way he won't have to resort to as many nightmare ideas and torment. It seems a lot tamer than what he was doing before, and it's still possible he could get ink that way. Then after all that, Squidward could find ways to make Patrick sneeze too, or maybe pull some extra pranks on Patrick to get back at him. You know, just to even out everything that Squidward might have gone through thanks to Patrick. And if anything else, they could maybe get rid of those spider eggs at the end? Please? I'm sure they could have found a more satisfying, amusing way to wrap it up, but this... it just... ugh, yeesh. But hey, all things considered, this felt like a slightly smoother route than what I was expecting. Maybe not ideal, but hey, I was expecting worse at this point. But now we've only got a few episodes left, so let's see what we got next. Now, Little Yellow Book's one of those episodes I've noticed that manages to come up with something unique and could have worked until it had all that unnecessary cruelty jammed in. Though even if you've never seen the episode, I think we all know some aspects that came from it. Specifically, that one meme. My guess on the thought process here is based on the many painful instances that Squidward was put through in the many different episodes that came before, and now they wanted to turn the tables and try to have him be more of the cause of these painful instances starting against him, and maybe, just maybe, this could lead to some kind of satisfaction after the treatment that's been constantly pushed on him in a lot of these cases. Right?
Wrong!
Okay, so the way I see it, there could have been some space for some surprisingly creative and more amusing moments had this gone a different direction. Like if SpongeBob's diary entries were worded in a strange way that gave everyone the wrong impressions on what he was writing. This could have led to a variety of potential interactions among different characters that could have built up to those SpongeBob knows getting concerned or angry. Or they might even think he's preparing some kind of special event or has a hidden crush or something, just to find out later he was writing about completely different stuff and that everyone had the wrong ideas. And just think about the clever misunderstandings that can come from more direct characters with this kind of story too. Like not just Squidward, but maybe Sandy, Mr. Krabs, or Patrick. Maybe this way, they could probably also make a better reason to make Squidward unlikable. Though maybe not as much as they did here, to which the residents also turn against him at the drop of a hat even though they were on his side a few moments earlier and most of them clearly knew what was going on. If they really wanted to make Squidward this unlikable for a more satisfying outcome, they should have had a lot more thought put in this kind of thing, maybe with a better set of planning. Honestly, this episode might have had the most possible different outcomes I could think of from these episodes so far, to the point where I can imagine someone behind the scenes seeing something like this too, and eventually making an episode from that. And you know, I wouldn't blame them if they wanted to try it, but of course, we'd have to see where the execution actually goes first. And finally, let's wrap this up with Face Freeze.
I said freeze!
Honestly, this was one of the more conflicting episodes I've gone through. On one hand, I could already tell this episode was going to be one of the lower ones. Heck, I remember hating this episode myself after watching some of it in my teen years. But looking at it now, as well as the other episodes we've gone through here, I found this episode to be a lot tamer by comparison. I mean, when you really look at it, the biggest reason why so many people hate this episode is because SpongeBob and Patrick are making a bunch of unusual faces. But at the same time, I can't say the negative thoughts are completely outlandish. A good portion of these can come off as something you might see in nightmares, so I could understand why some are put off by this, just as I myself was long ago. But looking at these now, I can also see a variety of creativity shown through the different faces, with SpongeBob and Patrick serving as the canvases to show what the artists were capable of when putting this together. And that's a concept we never see that commonly, especially on this kind of scale. And when thought of it that way, it can seem a lot more interesting in that sense. So yeah, in the long run, this is a case where I can see why anyone would like this episode or not. But let's take it a step further and put it this way. While I see the ups and downs everyone has for this episode, I personally don't feel the episode itself worked too well simply because they tried to make a whole story revolving around these different faces. And in its place, they didn't really plan out the story itself as creatively as the faces they threw in, and thus leaving this episode more toward what could normally be a forgettable toss concept had it not been for those faces everyone's been complaining about to this day. But how about we give them a better setup to why they're making all these faces to begin with? Like, maybe they find out there's a contest being held for who can make the biggest variety of faces, or the most detailed faces. That way they could have more of a reason and context to make all these faces, and a more understandable motivation on what kept them going all this time. And not only that, this could also open up more of a variety of different themes for faces on some other characters too, and not just whatever looks as weird or as shocking as possible. They could expand on the provided examples to some faces that are cute, or goofy with charm, or realistic, or just something that might end up as another meme. But you see what I'm getting at, right? More characters means more potential canvases to work on for faces, and that also means more of a variety that might not put everyone off as much. Now, can this erase the complaints that came from this episode? Well, maybe not all of them, but I feel this may help add some substance so the whole shock factor isn't the only detail everyone has to look at the whole time. Oh, man, that was quite the handful to encounter. But seeing that the show's been going on for 15 seasons by this point, there was obviously going to be quite the pile of stinkers to find, as it may tend to happen with just about any show, especially one that lasted this long. But maybe the way we went around these episodes might make them at least a bit less of the pain they're known as among the public. But what do you fellas think? Would these changes have helped make these infamous episodes more tolerable to watch? Do you feel my fixes need some fixes of their own? Or would you take these concepts in a completely different direction? Feel free to let me know. In the meantime, I'm gonna take another nice long break from SpongeBob. At least again until that next movie, Search for SquarePants, finally comes out. Like I said before, it's been a while since I brought up the earlier SpongeBob movies, because you know, we were given a lot of substance recently. And on top of that, it would make more sense to wait for this movie's release to see how the more modern trilogy fully turns out. But like I always say at the end of these videos, we'll soon see, won't we?